In this half hour. Well, we'll shift gears, but not too much. It's still politics as usual here on Talk to the Neighborhoods. And in this segment, looking back to Beacon Hill, which of course ended its session on the 31st of July and caught in the logjam or, squeeze between the governor and the legislature. Of course, most eyes were focused on a bill that would have legalized casino gambling and some slot machines in Massachusetts. Well, we may not have heard the last of it. Still talk possibly about the legislature coming back and overriding governor's veto. And so my guest in this segment, who better than one of Speaker DeLeo's top committee people, his chair of the Joint Committee on Education from the House side. I'm talking, of course, about Representative Marty Walls from the 8th Suffolk District, Back Bay, right. Beacon Hill.
West End.
West End, excuse me. Some South End, if I remember.
No, Beacon Hill, Back Bay, West End, and Cambridge.
And a piece of Cambridge, I was going to say.
That's right.
They've redrawn some of those districts. Hey, welcome. Nice to have you here.
Great to be back.
There's so much to talk about, and I want to talk about especially some education matters. But first, the casino gambling bill. Is that the end of it for this year?
Unclear on whether it's the end of it or not. The legislature is trying to decide whether we're going to come back into session to deal with some federal money that's going to be coming our way. The U.S. Senate's voted, the House of Representatives voted today. I anticipate President Obama is going to sign the legislation this week. So several $100 million is going to be coming to Massachusetts. So
which was always kind of in play, right? Yeah. There was a possibility of this.
Right, so now it's on its way. As soon as the president signs it, it's on its way. And the question that we don't know the answer to yet, because literally the law is not signed by the president, is does the legislature need to come back into session before January to determine how that money should be spent? Right. Or is this a decision that can wait until January? So the question of what to do with the casino legislation in part hinges on whether we come back to deal with the federal money. But whether we come back or not, the Senate president has said she doesn't have the votes to override any veto by the governor of the casino gambling legislation. So it's still very much in play, but the outcome is still very much unclear for this legislative session. And if it doesn't happen, I anticipate we're going to see it again next session.
Well, and of course, any way you slice it, controversial. It's depending upon who you talk to, they fall both ways, and I'm sure you've found yourself also caught in between, and especially being one of the Speaker's lieutenants. Did you feel compelled to kind of stick with him? Did you? How did you vote?
I voted against the legislation.
Really?
I did, and it was a difficult decision, but in the end, I had to go with my constituents and what I think are the best interests of my district. My part of Boston and Cambridge is very much opposed to the legislation, and my constituents have made that very clear over and over and over.
You've been hearing that over the last 3 years?
I've been hearing it for the last 5 years since I've been in the legislature. It's been a very consistent message from my constituents, and I've been hearing it even as I've been going door to door in the last week since the session ended. Very consistent message. So my constituents give me a very consistent message that they don't want to see two or three casinos and all the slot machines at the racetracks. Very consistent message. And I also think it's not going to be good for my district economically. I think in the end it's going to result in transferring business to casinos rather than generating new business. And when you represent the downtown Boston neighborhoods, we worry that we're going to lose some of the arts organizations and the shops and the restaurants.
So you're not buying that whole argument that it's going someplace else. But I've got to ask you this. Did you get an out from the Speaker on this? That's a tough vote. Supposedly, and it sounded like it in his comments, an important vote for him.
It was a very important vote for him, and I knew that, and I think everyone in the legislature knew that. But in the end, I'm elected to serve the people of my district, and that's my job first and foremost. And while the Speaker certainly wanted me to vote yes on the bill, my job is to represent my district, and my district made it pretty clear where I needed to be on it, and that's where I was personally. So I'm sure he was disappointed, but I think he also understands my job first and foremost is to be a good representative for the people of Boston and Cambridge.
Again, Representative Marty Walls represents the 8th Suffolk District in pretty much the heart of downtown Boston. Back Bay, West End, Beacon Hill,
Yeah.
and even parts of Cambridge. Here tonight on Talk to the Neighborhoods as we do a little wrap-up on the legislative session. Representative, there was this kind of all-consuming passion discussion about the whole casino gambling issue, slots issue, that a lot of other things that happened kind of, I won't say they got swept under the rug, but they didn't get much attention. And I know this has been a big year for your committee, the Education Committee, starting with right at the beginning of the year, right, January, the whole ed reform issue that came to the fore. Massachusetts trying to get some of that race to the top money, and it involved making some tough choices that affected, you know, teachers, parents, students, and especially here in the city of Boston, where we've had some historically underperforming schools.
So the education reform legislation that I shepherded through, that we finished up in January, is already being implemented in the city of Boston. In fact, we had a meeting recently in the state legislature with Carol Johnson, the superintendent of schools, and she was bringing us up to date on everything that she's doing immediately to implement that law, so that when school opens in September, Boston's already doing the work. So Boston's far ahead of the other school districts in the state in implementing the reform law. We put in special language to acknowledge that Boston had already done some of the preliminary work by January, and we didn't want to slow the superintendent down. So she is well on her way of getting that law implemented for the start of school in September. And then the other districts across the state are catching up so that they're a little bit farther behind in the planning process, but then they will by January be ready to implement the law fully.
There's a lot of to and fro on that, and many of the, especially teachers' unions, not happy about that. What did that make it difficult in the end to get that bill through, and how did you navigate that?
Well, the most important thing to navigating between the superintendents, the school committees, parents, students, teachers, and all of the different unions is to really listen and try to determine what's in the best interest of the students. And if that's always the thing you come back to, then you can usually put together a bill that's going to achieve majority support in the legislature, and that's what we were able to do. Certainly, the unions were unhappy with the legislation, but we also made significant changes to the bill to address some of their very legitimate concerns. And so we were able to keep everybody at the table, keep everyone talking until we arrived at legislation that I think is going to really do right by kids. The school committees, the superintendents, everybody had to give and take a little, as did legislators. I mean, it was also hard to get majority support for the legislation. Anything that's that controversial is going to be difficult, but we were able to do it because, again, you always come back to, in the end, what's the best things to do for the children who are in our classrooms? And then if you keep that at the forefront, the right answers really emerge from there.
Well, despite that effort that was put forth, you know, at least so far, hasn't yielded much. In fact, Massachusetts, from my understanding, didn't qualify in the first round of funding for the race to the top. It's some pretty big money at stake there. Are we out of the running despite that?
No, there were several rounds of applications for the race to the top money, but I want to be clear about something, is that what we did in the education reform law needed to be done whether there was a race to the top application or not. That
It wasn't just about the money.
No, not at all. So even if we don't get the money, what is in the education reform law is going to help children learn. And in the end, getting the money would be great. We're still very much in contention for the second round of funding. We'll know later on this month or early September if we get it. But I think we always need to remember we need to turn around our underperforming schools whether we get that money or not. So what was in that legislation will be easier to do if we get the race to the top money, but we need to do it anyway, whether we get that money or not. There's too many kids that we're leaving behind, and we need to bring them up to where they need to be. Race to the top